The concrete is cold at this hour. Not cold the way a winter morning is cold, oh, with something alive in it, something that will eventually warm. Cold the way a surface is cold when no body has pressed against it for a long time. He sits at the edge of the enclosure, the furthest point from the cluster of bodies near the feeding wall. And he does not move, not because he is tired, not because something is wrong with him physically, The keeper checked that morning and again before lunch. He is small, and his face is a color somewhere between copper and rust, and his fur has the particular rough silk texture of a Japanese macaque who was groomed through infancy by hands rather than by another primate. He watches the troop the way you watch a crowd when you have lost someone in it, still. Just searching. In wildlife facilities across Japan, keepers have a phrase for the cases that stay with them longest. They call them the ones who keep reaching. The ones who were rejected not through aggression, not through dominance or resource competition, but through something quieter and harder to explain through absence. Through being simply consistently not chosen. Those are the cases that never fully leave a keeper's memory. This is one of them. He came in on a Tuesday, which no one would remember later, except the keeper who was handed him at the gate. She remembered it because she had been in the middle of eating lunch and she put the container down and never came back to it. And by the time she remembered it was there, something in the day had already shifted permanently. He was wrapped in a fleece cloth, Not the official facility cloth, but someone's personal one, a faded green with small white stitches along one edge, And whoever had wrapped him had done it carefully, had thought about warmth and not just containment. That detail stayed with her. The paperwork said he had been found at dawn near a trailhead on the lower slope of a forested preserve, already separated and already making no sound. A walker had heard nothing, had simply seen a shape in the leaf litter that was too small to be anything surviving on its own. The shape was still when the walker reached it, a body the length of a hand. Eyes partially open, the damp of the forest floor already working into the cloth of him, not moving, not crying, oriented toward nothing in particular, as if it had simply stopped in the middle of whatever it had been doing and found no reason to continue. There was no sign of the troop. There was no sign of the mother. There was only the pale light through the cedar canopy and the sound of the walker's own breathing, and the small, irreversible fact of him lying there. Japanese macaques are not solitary animals. They live in troops of sometimes 80 individuals, layered in social hierarchies that take years to read correctly. Who grooms, who sits near whom, who defers, and who receives. An infant separated from that structure within the first days of life has no road back without intervention. The nervous system is still building. The social templates have not yet been laid. What forms instead is something improvised, something assembled from whatever comes next. The keeper, whose name was Yuki, carried him from the gate to the care room without setting him down once, even when her phone buzzed in her pocket and she knew it was the afternoon coordinator wanting a status update. She would answer later. He weighed almost nothing. His fingers, and this is the detail that appears in her memory with the most clarity even now, his fingers wrapped around her index finger with a grip that was both instinctive and somehow deliberate. The grip of something that has decided, without any context yet, to support the decision that this is the direction worth trying. They named him Ren. No ceremony, no committee discussion. Just Yuki writing the name on the intake tag with a permanent marker. And the other keeper on shift, glancing over and nodding the way you nod when something feels already decided. The care room was small and lit by fluorescent panels that buzzed faintly when the building was quiet, which in the early mornings it almost always was. There was a metal shelf along one wall where the formula canisters were lined up by size, and a folding table with a heat lamp clamped to one edge, and beneath the lamp, a shallow box padded with a fleece blanket that Yuki had refolded 3 times before she was satisfied with the depth of it. She set him in the center of it. He did not curl into himself the way some infants do, the tight defensive posture of an animal, trying to take up less space in the world. He lay on his side legs, slightly extended, and looked at the ceiling of the lamp's light with an expression that was too early in his life to read as anything but that Yuki would describe later as open. Just open. The first nights were difficult, in the way first nights always are. The temperature checks, the formula volumes, the constant monitoring of breathing patterns and body weight. He did not sleep deeply. He slept in short intervals, and between intervals he would reach out with one hand, not grasping, just extending into whatever space was near him. Yuki learned to position her arm close enough that when his hand reached it, found something. She did not tell the facility director this. It was not protocol. But the sleep intervals lengthened and the formula intake stabilized. And after the first week, there was a quality to his waking that she hadn't seen in the early days. Something less like vigilance and more like presence. Ren was, they began to understand, unusually attentive. He tracked movement across the room with a focus that seemed disproportionate to his age. Not the startled tracking of an animal in stress, but the patient following attention of something genuinely curious about where things go. He would pause, whatever he was doing, eating, exploring a corner of the care enclosure, turning a piece of enrichment over in his hands, and orient towards something the keepers often couldn't identify. A vibration in the concrete. A change in air pressure before rain. Something in the register of the trees beyond the window. He was, as one of the researchers who visited put it carefully, highly relational. The word was meant clinically, but it lodged, because it was accurate in a way that clinical language doesn't usually manage to be. He was not seeking stimulation. He was seeking contact. He was reaching from the very beginning for connection with something and finding it provisionally, imperfectly, in the hands and voices of the people who came through the room each day. There was another one for a time. A younger male brought in 6 weeks after Ren with a different origin story, but a similar outcome, motherless early, and placed in care before the critical social windows had fully closed. The facility called him Sato. He was louder than Ren. He moved faster, cried more readily, demanded attention, with a frequency that the keepers found both exhausting, and they would admit later, easier to read. Sato's needs announced themselves. Ren's were quieter, folded into small gestures offered, and then partially withdrawn, as if still deciding whether to trust the offering. Together, though, something shifted. The care room had 2, and the dynamic changed the way a room changes when there are 2 living things in it instead of 1. They slept near each other within the first week, not touching at first, simply proximate 2 small bodies oriented toward the same wall. By the second week, Sato had begun a rudimentary grooming of Ren's shoulder not fully competent instinct, without the years of social modeling behind it, but genuine. Ren allowed it with a stillness that Yuki described afterward as the most settled she had seen him. Something more like located. Like he had temporarily found the coordinates of himself in relation to another living thing, and had organized something that had been disorganized. Japanese macaques begin learning their social language before their eyes are fully focused. Grooming is not hygiene. It is syntax the mechanism through which a troop member signals trust, earns proximity, and marks where it stands in relation to everything around it. Without it, the language is never fully learned. With even a partial version of it, even an improvised version traded between 2 orphans in a concrete care room, because something is transmitted that nothing else can transmit. In the mornings, when Yuki came in for the first feeding, she would sometimes find them already awake, doing what macaque juveniles do when they are comfortable enough to play Sato launching himself off a low ledge. Ren watching, then following, then stopping halfway through the motion, and sitting down to look at Sato with a kind of waiting attention, not unsure of the game, waiting to see if Sato would come back. Sato always came back. He would reverse direction, tumble toward Ren, land close, and the 2 of them would sit together for a moment before Sato was off again, and Ren would watch the direction he had gone and wait and eventually follow. It was not the play of animals who had grown up in a troop with 20 other juveniles, teaching them the precise geometry of chase and return. It was something smaller and more negotiated, a game with two players who were both still learning the rules and who had agreed implicitly that the learning itself was worth doing. They were not a troop. They were two small animals who had been handed the same loss and were in their proximity to each other, partially compensating for it. That was enough. For a while, that was enough. Sato left on a morning that was otherwise unremarkable. A transfer had been arranged a facility 3 hours north with a small managed troop, a structured introduction program and opening in their juvenile cohort. The paperwork was good. The timing was considered appropriate. These decisions are made with care with the animal's long-term social needs in mind, and there was no reason to believe this one was wrong. The carrier arrived the evening before. Yuki set it in the corner of the care room near the food shelf and went home. That night, the last night though, neither animal had any way to register it as such. Ren and Sato slept in their usual position. Sato pressed against the side of the sleeping box, Ren curled beside him with one arm extended across Sato's back. The room was the same room it always was. The heat lamp cast its same circle of warmth. The formula canisters stood in their same row on the shelf. Nothing announced itself. In the morning, Yuki came in at the usual hour, completed the usual checks, and then lifted Sato from the box to transfer him to the carrier. Ren watched from the far corner of the enclosure. He had moved there on his own, sometime between when Yuki arrived and when she reached for Sato. A distance he had put between himself and what was happening that no one had asked him to create. He was quiet. He watched Sato move into the carrier, watched the door close, watched Yuki lift it and carry it from the room. The room went still. Ren did not call. He did not press the walls, or climb the structure, or do any of the things a distressed animal might do. He walked slowly to the corner of the sleeping box where Sato had been lowered himself into it, and lay there on his side, face toward the wall for a long time. But the room afterward was a different room. He moved his sleeping position by several feet to the left, stopped initiating the climbing structure near where they had spent most mornings together, spent more time near the window than he had before, sitting with his face angled toward the outside light, in a way that was less like looking and more like listening. The keepers watched him orient toward the door several times. Over the following days, a motion so brief and so quickly suppressed that only the people who had been watching him long enough to know his stillness could distinguish it from nothing. He ate normally. He maintained weight. He passed every health check without difficulty. But there was something in him that had been quieted, and the keepers who had learned by then to read him in his own register felt it. Yuki wrote in the daily log, "Eating well, all vitals stable, behavior within range, AEO." And then beneath it, in her own handwriting that wasn't part of the official record, "He seems like he's decided something." She wasn't sure what. Neither was he, probably. But that quality of stillness, of something internally reorganized, did not fully lift. It shifted. It became the ground beneath everything that came next. The troop introduction was attempted on a morning in late autumn. The facility's main macaque group numbered 23 individuals, a mid-sized troop with a stable hierarchy. Several established adult females with strong matrilineal positions, a dominant male past his peak aggression years, and a cluster of juveniles who had grown up within the group's social rules and carried the ease of animals who had never needed to question where they stood. Ren was older now, and the preliminary fence line habituations had been running for several weeks. Ren on one side, troop on the other, each party allowed to examine the other at a distance of their own choosing. The troop was not alarmed by him. The troop, for the most part, was not interested. Not the flat, purposeful disinterest that signals territorial threat assessment, something more indifferent than that, the disinterest of animals whose social world was already fully populated, who saw nothing in this unfamiliar figure that demanded a response. During those weeks at the fence line, Yuki ran the observations in the late morning when the troop was most active and Ren's attention was sharpest. She would stand at the observation window with her clipboard and watch him sit. He sat at the shared fence line for hours, tracking the social movements of the group who followed whom, who groomed, which juveniles chased each other across the volcanic rock structures, which adult females held the warmest positions in the enclosure. He watched with the attention of someone studying a language they have heard from outside a window for years without ever being inside the room. On the 11th day, a juvenile from the troop approached the fence on the opposite side. She came within a meter, looked at Ren for approximately 3 seconds, a direct, flat assessment, and then turned and walked away. Ren did not move during this. He stayed at the same distance, in the same posture, and watched her go, and then went back to watching the troop. Yuki wrote in the log juvenile approach. No response from subject, no follow. She wrote it the same way she wrote everything, but she looked at it twice before she closed the notebook. The first full-access introduction was supervised by 3 staff. Ren entered the main enclosure at an hour when the troop was calm, moving with his body oriented downward, chin low, the correct social signal, non-threatening subordinate available. He had not been taught this. It is the shape the body finds when it is genuinely uncertain and open to what comes. The dominant male assessed him briefly from a height of several meters, looked away, and did not come down. This was technically the best possible outcome of that first moment. The adult females nearest to his entry point moved away, without alarm, without threat display, without the sharp vocalizations that signal active rejection. They simply moved, created distance, continued their own activities as if the space he had entered was not quite occupied. He moved toward the juvenile cluster eventually, because the instinct toward proximity is powerful, and the juvenile cluster was the nearest available social warmth. The juveniles tolerated his approach to a distance of roughly 2 meters. Then 2 of them relocated. He followed with the careful, readable optimism of an animal who has not yet understood what is happening. The afternoon passed this way. He moved. Space was created. He approached again. Space was created again. By dusk, when the keepers separated him back into his individual holding area, he had been in the same enclosure as 23 other members of his species for 4 hours and had not been groomed once, had not been invited into proximity by a single animal. Japanese macaques are not cruel. That is the hardest part to understand from outside it. There was no violence in what happened that day. No dominant animal putting him in his place. No juveniles chasing him away. Just a social world that had its own logic, its own structure, its own population of established relationships, and no particular mechanism for absorbing a new individual who had arrived without a mother, without a matriline. Without the accumulated social debt that you spend years building in a troop, trading small favors of attention and grooming for the right to sit closer, to eat first, to be seen. He had none of that. He had only himself and a body that knew the correct postures and eyes that tracked social behavior with the intensity of someone who wants very badly to understand. For a species that lives almost entirely through social contact, where grooming is currency, where being held in the cluster during a cold night is the difference between safety and exposure. Invisibility is not neutral. It is its own kind of loss. The keepers ran the introductions over several more weeks. The outcomes were consistent. Simply, he remained at the margin of a world that had no opening for him through no fault of his own, and no fault of the troops either. Just the mathematics of a social structure that was already complete. Yuki stood at the observation window on the last afternoon of the formal introduction protocol, and watched him sit at the edge of the enclosure near the concrete wall, where no one else tended to sit, and groom his own forearm with slow, methodical movements. Self-grooming in macaques often increases under social stress. It is a self-regulatory behavior, a way the body manages what the social world cannot provide. She knew this. She also knew that watching it was one of the hardest things she had done in 2 years at the facility. The cup of coffee she had brought out with her had gone cold in her hand without her noticing. The troop moved behind him, grooming, clustering, calling, and he sat apart from all of it with his face turned toward the concrete wall, tending to himself with the quiet persistence of an animal that has decided to continue. Because nothing dramatic had happened. Because nothing had. The days that followed were ordinary in every measurable way. There was a cat. This is not a detail anyone planned. The cat had arrived at the facility the previous spring through a combination of circumstances that no one fully agreed on. Some said it had followed a delivery truck through the service entrance. Some said it had simply appeared one morning and established territory in the way that cats do quietly and without asking permission. It was gray, older by the look of it, with the settled quality of an animal that has learned which battles are worth engaging, and long since stopped engaging the others. It lived primarily in the maintenance corridor between the two main enclosures, and the facility staff fed it with a tolerance that stopped just short of official acknowledgement. No one named it. This was everyone understood implicitly how you kept a thing unofficial. Ren encountered it first through the wire mesh that separated the maintenance corridor from his individual holding area. The cat was sitting on the opposite side, doing what the cat did most of the time, existing in a compact, self-sufficient way that communicated nothing in particular to anything in particular. Ren approached the mesh with his chin low, the posture his body defaulted to when it was genuinely uncertain. The cat looked at him. This was already more than the troop had offered. The cat looked at him with the flat, unimpressed attention of a creature that has sorted most things. It has encountered into categories of threat or non-threat, and placed him firmly in the second, and then did not look away. They sat on opposite sides of the mesh for most of that afternoon. Ren explored the wire with his fingers, the way he explored most surfaces methodically, with the texture seeming to interest him as much as whatever lay beyond it. The cat at some point lay down. This is not a reconciliation story in any neat sense. The cat did not become a surrogate companion. The facility staff did not engineer a moment out of it. What happened was smaller and more real than that. What happened was that Ren had found something that would sit near him without moving away, that would meet his attention with something other than absence. And that this small, unremarkable asymmetrical contact across a wire mesh was enough to change the quality of his days. He began using the area near the mesh as his primary resting spot, bringing objects there. Small pieces of enrichment material, a fragment of burlap from a worn bag, and placing them near the wire in a way that suggested no particular logic, but was clearly deliberate. The cat remained indifferent to the objects, but the cat remained. A few weeks later, Yuki noticed that Ren had begun eating his midday feeding at the wire rather than at the platform where food was placed. He would carry a piece of food from the platform sometimes across a distance that required 3 careful trips and eat it sitting at the mesh with the cat on the other side doing nothing in particular, facing no particular direction. He was not offering the food. He was eating near the cat, practicing the proximity in the only form available to him until proximity itself became something he carried in his body, rather than something he had to reach for. Around the same time, a new keeper started. His name was Haruto. He was 24, fresh from his certification program, still at the stage of his career, where every animal in the facility felt like a problem he needed to solve correctly. He had studied the protocols carefully. He had been taught not to project human emotional frameworks onto animal behavior, not to initiate contact in ways that disrupted trained routines, not to mistake proximity for affiliation or affiliation for attachment. On his first day in Ren's holding area, he moved through the space exactly as he had been trained, to the right pace, the right angle of approach tools held at the appropriate distance from his body, eye contact calibrated to avoid direct threat signaling. He completed the cleaning rotation and the enrichment placement and the weight check and the behavioral observation log, and he came out of the enclosure and stood in the corridor for a moment with his clipboard. He had done everything correctly. Ren had spent the entire time at the far corner of the enclosure watching him. He had not approached once. The next afternoon, Haruto came in to do the afternoon check and got caught up making a correction to the morning log before he entered the enclosure, standing at the folding table near the door with his pen moving slowly through the form. He took longer than usual. He was not performing anything, he simply needed to think through the correction, and thinking slowed him down. And by the time he looked up, Ren was standing 2 feet away, watching him with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything. Haruto went still. Ren did not. He moved one step closer, reached out and touched the edge of the clipboard with 2 fingers, not taking it, not pulling, just making contact with the thing that was in contact with the human, and then withdrew and sat down nearby. Haruto stood there for a moment, and then wrote in the margin of the log he had been correcting, "Didn't approach on protocol. Approached when I stopped performing it." He mentioned it to Yuki later, and she nodded in the way of someone who recognized the experience. Without needing it explained, and neither of them said anything further about it, because some things are more accurately left in the category of things that happened than things that are analyzed. Some months passed, the way the later months of a long project pass, not in events but in the gradual accumulation of small regularities, each one slightly different from the one before. Ren grew. The facility grew familiar to him in the way places become familiar, when they are the only place not loved, not resented, just known the way. You know the sound of a particular door or the quality of light at a particular hour. He was not the fastest animal in the facility. He was not the most acrobatic, and visitors who came on public days tended to watch the main troop on the volcanic rock structures, the juveniles chasing the adults, grooming in the elevated positions, the dominant male moving through the group with the particular unhurried authority of an animal who has not needed to assert himself in years. The troop drew the eye. Ren was in the adjacent space, and the adjacent space was quieter, and quiet does not draw the eye. The macaques in the main troop moved across the rock structures. With a fluid, habitual confidence, they had mapped every surface, knew every handhold, had inherited their positions in the hierarchy along with their positions in space, so that the entire enclosure was a kind of extended body memory, a landscape they occupied without thinking. Rin moved as if he was deciding about each surface as he encountered it, slower, more considered. And the keepers who had watched him long enough noticed that he stopped more often. He would climb partway up the structure and sit, look out at the main enclosure, at the troop, at the movement he was not part of. There was no resignation in it. That is the word keepers sometimes reach for when they describe an animal that has accepted a limitation, and it is almost never quite right, and it was not right here. What he was doing in those long pauses from the middle of the structure was something more like attention. Sustained, unbothered attention to a world he was adjacent to and not inside. He had found other ways to practice the social language he had been building toward since the beginning. With Haruto, the grooming had begun without either of them precisely initiating it. Haruto had been checking Ren's coat as part of the routine health assessment, working through the fur along the shoulder and upper back with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done the task many times, and Ren had simply turned and begun returning the motion. Small, careful movements through the short hair on Haruto's forearm, parting it, following the grain of it, moving with the focused attention of a macaque doing what macaques do when they have decided that another living thing is worth their time. Haruto froze. He stayed exactly as he was, hands at rest, not withdrawing, while Ren worked through the motion with the unhurried focus of an animal performing something important. He let it continue. He would not have been able to explain why, and he did not try to. The grooming lasted perhaps 4 minutes before Ren's attention drifted toward whatever had moved at the edge of his visual field. Haruto sat very still for a moment after it ended. Then he continued the health check. He mentioned it to Yuki that evening, and she listened without expression, and then she said, "He did that to me once in the 2nd month, and I had to take a minute before I could go back to the intake form. There is a sound that Japanese macaques make that is distinct from all their other vocalizations, softer than the alarm call, different from the contact call used to maintain proximity in dense vegetation, lower and shorter than the coo grunt of an animal that is content but still engaged with the world around it. Researchers describe it as occurring specifically in the context of close, trusted social contact. In a troop setting, you hear it during grooming, during the particular kind of rest where 2 animals have decided without announcement to spend time in the same small patch of warmth. One afternoon, a cold one, The kind where the light through the enclosure windows came in flat and pale, and made everything look like a photograph of itself. Haruto sat on the bench after completing his afternoon check and stayed there reading over his notes in no particular hurry. A bird moved across the high window above the enclosure. Both of them looked up. The bird was gone. Both of them looked forward again. Haruto turned a page. Ren sat. It was the particular quality of two living things in the same space, not requiring anything of each other, not performing any version of themselves for the other's benefit, just present in the flat winter light in the quiet of the late afternoon. Ren made this sound for the first time on an afternoon like that one in the 3rd month of Haruto's rotation. He had been sitting beside Haruto on the bench, and Haruto had absently placed his hand palm up on the surface beside him, not as an invitation, just as the place his hand happened to land. Ren looked at it, placed his own hand in it, closed his fingers, and made the sound. Haruto did not move. He looked at their hands, the small macaque fingers folded across his palm, the complete and unremarkable fact of it. And he stayed exactly as he was until Ren's attention drifted, as it eventually always did, toward the window, toward whatever was beyond it. He looked it up that evening. He sat with what he found for a long time. The seasons that followed were quiet. In the way that seasons are quiet when the large things have already happened, and what remains is simply the living of them. The troop did not open. That is not the ending of this story, and to call it a failure would be to apply a metric that Ren himself did not seem to use. Over time, and the timeline here is long measured in seasons rather than days. Something at the margins of the main enclosure shifted in small, unannounced ways. 2 adult females from the troop began spending time in the area nearest the wire fence of Ren's holding space. On certain afternoons, when the sun had moved to that particular angle and the concrete held warmth at the base of the wall, they would come to that section of the enclosure and sit. They did not approach the fence directly. They did not vocalize toward Ren or display any of the social behaviors that would indicate active recognition. But they were there, and Ren moved to his corresponding side of the wire on those afternoons, also not approaching directly, just present on his side of it in proximity, occupying the adjacent space. One afternoon, one of the females came closer to the fence than she usually did, within a meter, close enough that Ren could have reached the wire with 2 steps. She sat. She looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him with the direct, brief attention of an animal making an assessment. 2 seconds. 3. Then she looked away toward the enclosure interior, toward the rest of the troop. She did not leave. She sat in that position for another 40 minutes, facing inward, while Ren sat on his side of the wire, facing the same direction. Yuki wrote in the log, "Adult female FEF. 4. Sustained proximity to holding fence. No contact, no vocalization. Subject remained at wire." She wrote it in the official record. Because it was real. Because small things, when they are real, deserve to be recorded. The cat still used the maintenance corridor. Ren still brought objects to the wire. Haruto still came in on his rotation days and sat on the bench when the afternoon allowed it, and sometimes the grooming happened, and sometimes it did not, and neither of them seemed to need it to be one thing or the other. He was, Haruto said once, at the end of a long shift, talking to no one in particular, the most patient animal he had ever worked with. Yuki heard it from across the corridor. She thought about the word patient and whether it was accurate, and decided it was close, but not quite right. Because patience implies waiting for something, and she wasn't sure Ren was waiting for anything anymore. She thought what he was doing was something else. Something that looked like patience from the outside but was from the inside, more like a decision that had been made so long ago it no longer required renewal. The concrete is still cold in the early mornings. He still arrives at the same corner first, the furthest point from the cluster of bodies near the feeding wall, and he sits. He sits with his face turned toward the main enclosure, watching the troop move through their day, the grooming, the clustering, the social language of a world that has no formal opening for him. And then the afternoon light shifts, and somewhere on the other side of the fence, two familiar shapes settle near the wire. And he turns, moves to his side of it, sits. The distance between them is the same it has always been. And it is also somehow less than it was.